My parents were both war correspondents and documentarians and authors, and that was kind of how I discovered documentaries, because our basement of our house in D.C. was an editing suite.
No, really?
So it was like the old Avid. So I grew up to the sounds of like... They were cutting. My mom worked at 60 Minutes for years. Right. It was fascinating to be a kid sitting on the carpet watching them cut these pieces, and it was how I fell in love with documentaries. And
documentaries, such a big part of your life growing up, so
yes.
It makes some sense that the film we have here from the Maysles brothers in 1975, Grey Gardens.
And I think Grey Gardens is one of the great documentaries. And the Maysles brothers essentially just became flies on the wall, where they were observing these two incredibly eccentric women.
So they definitely are flies on the wall. We're going to talk about whether it was exploitative. We'll wait to have that at the end. It's an interesting conversation anyway. But while they do make themselves flies on the wall, the idea is to shoot everything. They also, within, as you'll see, within the first 45 seconds or a minute, they make their presence known to the audience. Like the second voice you hear in the documentary is David Maysles. And so they're like, oh, they're here and they're shooting. And the fact that they are shooting is acknowledged. And I think that's a very critical decision.
It's absolutely critical. And I think that they make it clear, and they're acknowledging that there is an effect they're having on this environment, which very rarely has visitors. So just by the nature of entering the space, they're changing the chemistry. And it is still incredibly restrained in terms of what they capture. You see that they let this they let this performance happen around them, but acknowledging that in a way they are being performed for.
Right. They are affecting it.
Yes.
But what we still see is authentic. I mean, it's really something. I don't want to give too much away, and obviously people will pick it up right away, but this is a 77-year-old woman and her 55-year-old daughter in a house they've lived in East Hampton full-time. This is not their summer home.
What is incredible is they're incredibly unencumbered by any sort of societal expectations in the way that they dress or undress. Big Edie is often seen sunbathing nude, or the way that they dance and sing. They don't live by the
and even by the way they argue with each other.
Oh, by the way they argue.
A lot of arguing,
And yet, the way that they just live on their own kind of clock. This house has 29 rooms. They stay together in a small bedroom. Yeah. The love story is really profound. It's also significant that it was made by brothers, the film, about this family, a mother and daughter. There's a kind of family affair, sort of intimacy that you feel from both sides of the camera.
Before we show the film, connected as you did in the first film, like why you programmed it with Auntie Mame, which we had earlier tonight.
I believe that Grey Gardens is almost the, what could be argued as the kind of like real life version of Auntie Mame. I believe that in at least Big Edie's head, she is living as Mame. They're both stories about eccentric
women.
Like
see squalor, Big Edie doesn't see
Not
that
at all.
Yeah.
Little Edie is frustrated mostly by the kind of like politics of the neighborhood. Right. She wants to go and live in the city and live this amazing kind of free life, which she eventually did after the film.
Yeah, she says, any little rat hole, even on 10th Avenue, would be better.
Yes, they're real New Yorkers, is what I love about
real New Yorkers.
But one of the famous lines from Auntie Mame is, life is a banquet and most poor suckers are starving to death. And I think you can imagine that line being said by Big Edie in Grey Gardens.
100%. Let's watch it now. From the Maysles brothers, Albert and David in 1975. This is Grey Gardens. I am back with director Olivia Wilde. Olivia, thanks for being here.
So great to be here.
This has been such a lovely conversation. Olivia programmed tonight's double feature. We had Auntie Mame. We just saw Grey Gardens. So there's a lot of arguing in this. I don't like it when people talk over each other. Like in my life, when my daughter and my wife, I'm like, stop! But you get used to it. It's part of the communication of little, and they're almost like having separate, they're saying full sentences while the other person is talking.
They can hear each other. Yeah, that's what's amazing. They can hear each other while they're speaking.
Right, they're sort of responding, and
I always think when I watch this film, you could never write this. I mean, maybe like Robert Altman, you could just, it would be really tricky.
It would be a Robert Altman film.
It would be a Robert Altman film, but like be really tricky to perform. Any actor would really struggle. And of course, they have made narrative versions of this film, but I think what's so hard to nail is that they are completely in their own heads, and yet they're completely connected. They don't miss a beat of each other's words.
That last fight that we see, their last argument, That one's a little bit heartbreaking. And of course, we don't know what's true.
The filmmakers never explain that for us.
That's right. We
don't go to any sort of like footage or photography or any sort of text or any voiceover that explains what really happened.
No, all we get is old newspaper clippings that they just sort of pan over. That's it.
They each have their own narrative. Yeah. We don't know if Big Edie was protecting little Edie, which I always get the sense that little Edie needed to come home and be protected by her mother just as much as her mother needed to be protected by her daughter. But that fight is an example of leaving the audience in a place of curiosity. We don't really need to know. It's sort of their business. What we know is what their versions of the narrative are now.
The sense of who the Maysles brothers were comes through in how they found Big Edie and Little Edie. So Lee Radswell, who was Jackie Kennedy's sister and a cousin to Little Edie, hired them to do a story on the Bouvier family.
Yes.
Right? And in that process, the Maysles brothers met Big Edie and Little Edie, and they were like, how are we going to do this?
Like any great filmmaker, they pivoted towards the more interesting story.
And Lee Radswell was like, no. She kept all that footage.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so they had to go, they went back and started over.
Raised money and they went back.
Yeah.
I think it's very hard to do that now. I think often when you go raise money to make a documentary, people want to know the story and the structure, and they kind of want to know the ending, when the whole point of the art form is to ask questions without knowing the ending.
You sound like you probably have a documentary in you.
Yes.
At some point.
Yes, I would love to. But I think it takes real courage to shoot one like the Maysles. I don't know if I could do that. I think I'm too heavy-handed. I think I would try to manipulate what the audience was feeling as opposed to just like letting it happen.
There's been a lot of criticism of them. I mean, first of all, they're acknowledged as seminally important documentarians. There's no doubt about that. But, they weren't flies on the wall as much as they would have had you believe. There are those who think that this was exploitative.
Sure.
I take it I can tell you're not in that camp.
I'm not, because I don't watch the film and laugh at them in a way
there's some stuff that's funny, but I don't feel like I'm laughing at them.
No, I'm quite inspired by them as people. I understand that they've been dealt a really kind of unfair hand in life. I watch it and wish that, they could have Auntie Mame's riches so that they could, live the dreams that they deserve. I don't want them to change anything about themselves except not be forced to move out of their house because it's been condemned.
Don't you feel like if somebody gave them $2.5 million, they'd still live in the same room?
I think they would absolutely live in the same room, but they would maybe live without the stress of being told they have to leave. I mean, the fleas that they talk about in the film, like, oh, this house is full of fleas. I mean, little Edie constantly derides the house, the conditions in the house. She's saying, I can't take it here anymore. So it's something that she wants to draw attention to, that she wants to break out of this cage, and yet there's Big Edie saying it's beautiful, and I had a beautiful marriage, and I have a beautiful house. It's so interesting. They just have two different perspectives on the exact same life, and yet this is the only way they can really live. I think that it's complex in the way that any good film should be. It leaves you asking questions as opposed to having conclusions. And I understand the argument that there's something about it that's really sad.
Yeah, there's definitely something about it that's sad.
But I also celebrate any illustration or depiction of individuality like that. And I think there's something really romantic about their kind of decadent individualism. And I feel inspired by it.
Olivia Wilde, this has been fascinating. I've learned so much. This has been one of the great conversations I've had. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor.
Thanks again. Really so wonderful. Stay with us. Olivia.